Hello, I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York. Welcome to One to One. I'm delighted to welcome Carla Kaplan to the program. She's the Davis Distinguished Professor of American Literature at Northeastern University, and her latest book, Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance, has just been published by HarperCollins. A lot's been written about the African American artists, writers, entertainers, and intellectuals who burst onto the public scene during the Harlem Renaissance of the 1920s to the mid-30s. Also well documented are the white men who encouraged this outpouring of creativity and energy with their money and influence. But what about the white women who were so drawn to what was happening in Harlem that they risked the derision of their families to be a part of it? What they brought to Harlem and what they gained from it is the subject of Carla Kaplan's book and of our discussion today. Welcome.
Thank you.
So why a book about the white women of the Harlem Renaissance?
Well, the first answer, the simplest answer, is it's an untold story. It was the last untold story, really, of the Harlem Renaissance, and a story we didn't have at all. These were women who were, as you say, risking extraordinary derision, but also who were doing something that in their day was considered unthinkable, choosing blackness over whiteness in the 1920s. And for so long, that choice ended up in some ways making this an untold story. So the first reason to tell the story is we needed it to fill out the rest of our history.
Miss Anne, where does the term come from?
So as far as we know, and I've done a lot of work trying to figure out where that term first came from, it seems to have been a term coined well before the Harlem Renaissance by black female Southern domestic workers who were stuck in the kitchens of white women employers for 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day, sometimes 17 and 19 hours a day, and could not afford to deride or disrespect those women to their faces. They were employers, but behind their back, they could refer to them categorically and dismiss them as Miss Anne.
Miss Anne.
So it's the counterpart to Mr. Charlie and Mr. Eddie, which are also derisive terms for white folks.
Okay. You chose well, there are a number of Miss Annes in your book, but you concentrated on maybe about a half dozen or so of them.
Right.
The women are each fascinating in different ways, but was there something that they all had in common?
There were a number of things they all had in common. One of them was that every one of these women, and you're exactly right, that the six are very different. And in fact, I deliberately chose six who exemplify a range of roles white women played in the Black Harlem Renaissance so that readers could see women who were there with honorable intentions, who were there with dishonorable intentions, and pretty much everything in between. But every one of them shared an idea, very novel in the 1920s, that identity could be something other than biology. And every one of them believed that they could, in essence, volunteer for blackness. Each of these white women was in Black Harlem or writing about Black Harlem in an effort, essentially, to say, sign me up. I want to be black too. And this was an idea that was very pioneering in the 1920s, and they all shared it.
They were they were rule breakers.
Absolutely.
They were breaking the rule.
Yep.
They tended to lead with their passions.
Yep.
They were committed to fair play. They want to escape from the routine of, I guess, white middle class or upper middle class womanhood and all the restrictions that and they also were looking for a sense of purpose, is my sense.
Yes.
That I get from the book.
Go ahead.
So let's talk about some of the women you write about. Josephine Cogdell Schuyler was one. Tell us about Josephine.
So she's emerging for many people as the favorite character in the book for probably pretty good reason. Josephine Cogdell Schuyler was born in Texas. She was an heiress. She was born into a very wealthy Texas family in Granbury, Texas. But they weren't just wealthy white Texans, they were also part of a very racist community. Her father was a charter member of the Klan. She wrote about that. Her brothers were all members of the Klan. She was raised in a very racist milieu. She was also a classic new woman. Like all the women in this book, you're exactly right, she wanted to escape. She looked at the script of gender that was laid out before her, and people need to remember the 20s were a very sexist time in American culture. She looked at what women were allowed to do, and she said, oh no, this is nowhere near good enough for me. So she did what a lot of women did. She became a new woman. She went to San Francisco, then she went to Greenwich Village. She still wanted a bigger sphere, and she had her eye on Harlem. She went up into Harlem. She met George Schuyler. They fell in love the very day they met. He was the most important African-American journalist of his day. I don't have to tell you that as a journalist. I'm sure you're very familiar with him. And they fell in love, and they married. And in her marriage to George Schuyler, she adopted at least half a dozen other personae, including passing as a black woman. So she used her marriage to George Schuyler to carve out a very unlikely sphere for herself, but also a bigger sphere. And she passed as a number of other characters.
In her writing.
In her writing and in her life. She did not always self-identify as white. She was nervous about being in an interracial marriage. Wasn't illegal in New York, but it was very much frowned upon. And so when people thought, well, maybe she's a very, very light-skinned black woman, she would let them think so, including on the day she got married. So from the day she got married onward, she passed as, in her writing, but also in her life, a number of other characters.
What was it that, I gathered that the attraction between her and George Schuyler was immediate. What do you think?
Instant.
What attracted her to him and what attracted her to Harlem?
Well, this is part of what makes their story so interesting, but also so indicative of the time. On the one hand, there's no question that part of what drew them to each other emotionally and sexually was a fascination with racial difference. They saw each other as exotics, he for her and her for him. And they wrote about that. But at the same time, these were people who were deeply committed to an idea that race was a myth and that there was no difference between white and black. And this is something you find throughout the 1920s and 30s, is that people who are living that contradiction, who do not believe that there's any real difference between black and white, but who are fascinated by racial difference. And they embody that so strongly. In fact, if they hadn't been fascinated with racial difference, they would never have gotten together as a couple. They were completely mismatched.
Their marriage was not very popular among either the men or the women of Harlem.
That's right.
And she did not tell her parents, her family, that she was married to George.
Most of her family never knew about her marriage. In fact, my experiences in Granbury, Texas have been fascinating because I've now met family descendants who are thrilled to know they were related to her and who never really knew about her, and they're delighted to have her story. She felt her family could never understand or accept her marriage. Whenever she went back to Granbury, she went alone. Her husband stayed behind. Eventually, a few family members found out about the marriage. What's remarkable is that everybody didn't find out about it because they were a celebrity marriage. They were nationally famous. They were in newspapers and magazines across the nation. They were referred to as America's strangest family. Their daughter, Philippa, was world famous as a pianist and a composer. And they were written about everywhere they went, and yet the Granbury family didn't know anything about them.
It was not, in the end, it was not a happy marriage. As you said, they were mismatched. She was looking for freedom, and she found herself, George thrust her into this position of being, the marriage was all about George. They both worked to burnish George's careers, even though she continued to write. He was away a lot, working. He was a philanderer. And he became increasingly conservative. I mean, like really, really, really. John Birch. Anti-civil rights movement conservative.
That's right.
And there was a tragedy. I mean, their daughter was brilliant.
The daughter was killed
in a plane crash. Yeah. Right. And eventually, Josephine committed suicide.
She did. It's tragic.
She seemed to have been not only one of the most interesting, but perhaps the most tragic of the women in the book. Do you agree?
I do think she was one of the most tragic in the book. I have to say, this is a book with a lot of bold and pioneering and brave and exciting experiments in it, but not a lot of happy endings.
Right.
Most of the women who essayed this social experiment, who said, I'm signing up for blackness, I'm volunteering, it didn't work out that happily for them. Now, Josephine, as you say, was in many ways the most tragic, not just because her daughter died and then she committed suicide, but because here she was marrying a man she thought was one of the most radical men in America, and that's why she loved George. And when she met him, he was a socialist, and she was a socialist. And she thought, you know, I'm marrying one of the most famous radicals in the country, and she thought that was going to open up American radical circles. And as you point out, he moved further and further to the far, far right wing. There's no evidence that Josephine followed him there. But she was a very loyal woman, and she never criticized his politics in public. But how wrenching that must have been for her, to think she was marrying this wonderful radical and to watch him go further and further to the right, in fact, towards the politics she had been raised with. It must have been crushing for her, and she never said a word about it in public.
It reminds me of a book I read long ago called The New Women and the Old Men.
Well, I mean, there was a sort of tragedy for her in being this bold new woman and marrying a man. He was also very conservative on gender. She never saw that. She was so fascinated by racial difference and by racial politics, about which she knew very little when she married him, that she couldn't see what an incredible sex and gender conservative he was. He wanted a traditional marriage.
Right.
And she found out about that the hard way.
Charlotte Osgood Mason, very different type of, very different Miss Anne. Tell us about her.
And much older. This is in part a book about two generations of white women who became involved in Black Harlem. An older generation, which Charlotte Osgood Mason in many ways exemplifies, and a younger generation. Now, Mason, like Schuyler, was involved in Black politics partly for her own reasons. Again, she wanted a wider social sphere. She wanted to make a difference. But Charlotte Osgood Mason, she's one of the most complicated figures in this book. She believes, and I quote her now, that she is a Black god. She also thought she was the world's psychic physician. Her husband had been a famous spiritualist, and she believes that certain people, they have to be very special people, can channel psychic vibrations, and she believes she can do that so effectively that she can heal the world. She's also a primitivist. She believes that American white mainstream Western culture is played out, washed out, dried out, depleted, and the way it can be healed is to channel primitive energies, the energies of so-called childlike people.
Like Native Americans and Africans.
Exactly. So what she sets out to do very deliberately, she is going to build a bridge from primitive Africa to washed out America, and the bridge is going to be through Black Harlem. She is one of the most important philanthropists of the Harlem Renaissance, one of the most important white underwriters of Black culture. But she does this because she's going to heal modernity by channeling Black energy. So she comes in with a very set agenda. On the other hand, she has an enormous pocketbook. This woman has virtually unlimited funds, and she has an incredible eye for genius.
And she supports people like Zora Neale Hurston, Langston Hughes. Did she also support financially Alain Locke?
She almost.
Okay.
She supported Alain Locke. He was the one who stays with her right up basically until her death.
How about County Cullen? Was he a beneficiary?
County Cullen was not a particular beneficiary, although she would have liked him to be. She went after all of the geniuses of the Harlem Renaissance, and she recognized their genius. This was enormously meaningful to them. So Zora Neale Hurston and Langston Hughes and Alain Locke in particular were able to do much of the cultural work they did because of her largesse. That's right.
But while she was very generous, she was also monstrous. She was demanding, critical, controlling of her protégés, who they called her godmother. Was that the term?
They called her godmother, and she insisted on being called godmother by them, but also by the white protégés she was supporting. What's interesting is that they eventually, except for Alain Locke, who loved her to her death and beyond, he loved her to his own death. He saw her as a second mother. Eventually, Zora Neale Hurston began to see her as monstrous. Langston Hughes never did. He carried to his own grave a real wound about his breakup with Charlotte Osgood Mason. We see her so instantly as monstrous, her imperiousness, but also her set ideas about Blackness and primitivism. What's interesting is how many of the great Black artists of the Harlem Renaissance, particularly in the 1920s and early 30s, truly loved this woman.
That's interesting.
It is interesting because we can say, oh, she was a monster. But what they said is, oh, well, she has these very set ideas. Most white people did during the day. She also adored blackness. She loved blackness. She set it above whiteness. What people forget is how unusual that was, how unusual it was for black artists to find white people who adored blackness.
Okay.
And she was very, very passionate in that adoration of blackness, enough so that she captured not just the attention, but the love of people like Hughes and Hurston. Part of what I'm trying to get at in the book is how somebody who was so monstrous could also be so adored.
Okay.
And it speaks to the complexities of this moment.
We're going to have to take a short break. Then we'll be back after this message with more with Dr. Carla Kaplan, author of Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance. Welcome back to One to One. I'm Cheryl McCarthy of the City University of New York, and I'm talking with Dr. Carla Kaplan, author of Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance, published by HarperCollins. Tell us about Fannie Hurst.
My least favorite. Fannie Hurst was someone I went back and forth about whether to put in the book, because she is, for me, the truly negative example. Everyone thought Charlotte Osgood Mason would be the truly negative example because she's the monster. But Charlotte Osgood Mason at least brought into Black Harlem a true love of blackness. Fannie Hurst is the character in this book who most exemplifies for me a white woman who comes into Harlem really for her own advantage and truly for her own purposes. So she is there principally to write Imitation of Life, which is, I think most people know as a movie rather than as a novel. And she's there largely because of her friendship with Zora Neale Hurston, always one of the most uneven friendships in American interracial literary history.
Really?
Yeah, it was always a friendship in which Zora Neale Hurston called her Miss Hurst, lifelong, and Fannie always called her Zora. And Fannie Hurst was very patronizing. And her idea for Imitation of Life was given to her by Zora Neale Hurston on a road trip. Fannie Hurst told Zora Neale Hurston they'd go meet Hurst's agent. But instead, they went off to meet Hurst's boyfriend. She was actually having a long-term affair with an explorer named Stephenson. She told Hurston she'd take her to meet her agent, Elizabeth Marbury, and show her Niagara Falls. And then they veered off to Canada so that Hurst could go see Stephenson. And all along the way in the car, they were exchanging stories. Now we have to imagine, here they are in the car. They're going to see Hurst's boyfriend. It's a secret trip. It's an affair. And Hurst is sitting in the back seat while Hurston drives the entire time. She sits in the back seat like something out of Driving Miss Daisy, right? But it's Driving Miss Hurst. And they're exchanging stories, and the idea for the story Imitation of Life takes shape on this road trip. Hurst takes it for granted that Hurston is going to not only give her the idea, but help her write the novel. And Hurston says, absolutely not, you're on your own. And it's one of the reasons we get a novel in which the passing story, so sacred to the African-American literary tradition, is really sort of, well, butchered by Fannie Hurst. The passing story was always a way to show how white culture was not worth envying. So it's a story in which you see black people go over to whiteness and they say, I don't really want to be here. But Fannie Hurst does the opposite. She depicts white culture as superior to blackness, and she never knows it. The book was described as a sensation in Harlem because she gets everything wrong, and yet it propels her into a career as a civil rights spokesperson, and Fannie Hurst holds on to that position for the rest of her life.
And the book was a blockbuster hit.
Blockbuster.
But it contained a lot of stereotypes and a lot of the black dialect, and
Exactly.
her friends in Harlem felt betrayed by the book.
Well, now, it was a blockbuster for white readers.
Right.
Almost everything Fannie Hurst did was a blockbuster. I mean, in terms of sales, we have to remember Fannie Hurst was the Stephen King of her day. She was the best-selling author of her time. And Imitation of Life was a book written to be a particular kind of blockbuster. She felt she wasn't being taken serious enough by the critics, that she was being dismissed as a women's writer and as a writer of ethnic, tear-jerking, sentimental fiction. She wanted to be taken more seriously, and so she said, "Oh, I'll write about race. Race is something the critics know is serious business." So this was a book that was designed not just to sell, but to elevate her position. And it really did with white readers, and it really did with the critics, and her black friends in Harlem, as you say, felt absolutely betrayed and rather crushed. However, the book propelled her. She wrote one novel about race. In everything she wrote, she treated race only one time. For a white writer, that was enough to become a civil rights spokesperson. So for me, Fannie Hurst is a cautionary tale about how little white people can do and suddenly become experts on blackness.
Right, right. It's still happening.
Well, that's what I mean. That's exactly what I'm saying, yes.
And in the book you write about other, Mary Ovington, was that her full name?
Mary White Ovington.
Mary White Ovington.
Founder of the NAACP.
Right,
Yep.
Nancy Cunard.
Nancy Cunard, in many ways my favorite, British heiress, loses everything because of her love of blackness, specifically originally one black man, but then black culture, and gives up one of the biggest fortunes in the Western world because of her commitment to race politics. Fascinating.
Now, she did come to a sad end, but it did not seem as tragic an end as, say, Josephine Schuyler. I don't know if you...
I don't think it was as tragic because Nancy Cunard was not in the same sense a suicide. I mean, Nancy Cunard comes to a terrible death. Spoiler alert, she dies a raving alcoholic on the streets, 67 pounds. But that's as much because of lifelong choices as it is because of her race choices. Josephine Cogdell Schuyler ends up with a very constricted social sphere when she married George to get a large social sphere. Nancy Cunard, you're right, she's not as tragic because she has a life that's very large.
Right.
She gets a large stage. She comes to a pretty sad death, but she has a very large cultural life, which is what she wanted for herself.
And she seemed to be more in control of things than Josephine Schuyler.
Much more in control. For one thing, she avoids marriage, so there's no man telling her what to do. Now, she doesn't get the family money, but she has a huge life. First, involved in the Harlem Renaissance, then involved in modernism. She lives as a journalist. She's the only white journalist, in fact, for the African National Publishing Company and Press, the African American answer to AP. She works as a journalist. She covers the Spanish Civil War. She travels around the world. She writes about Africa. She has an extraordinary life as a poet, as a writer, as a publisher. She publishes many of the modernists of her day. And she has a very large world stage, which is what she wanted.
So what did Miss Anne contribute to the Harlem Renaissance, and what did she get out of it?
What she got out of it, I'll answer that part first, was she got out of it a much larger world than she could have ever had otherwise. She got out of it a chance to make a difference, a chance to be part of the most important and exciting social movement of her day, and a chance to contribute to social change. Those were big things that she wanted. What she contributed was she took one of the ideas of modernism and the Harlem Renaissance, which was that identity could be choice. That identity wasn't biology, that identity didn't have to be a trap. We didn't have to be stuck in the identities we were born with. And she took that idea and pushed it as far as it could possibly go. And in that way, she took one of the most important ideas of Black Harlem and pushed it to a logical conclusion. Not everybody appreciated that, but it actually really furthered the debate.
What do you want readers to take from your book?
I think I want readers to take from my book the idea that we can push identity further, that we don't have to be stuck in the boxes that we were born in. But I think I also want readers to see through these women's lives that that experiment, pushing identity, usually comes at great cost. That it's something we can all do, but we shouldn't expect it to be easy, and we shouldn't necessarily expect it to be a jolly good time either.
Right. We have 1 minute left in which you're going to tell me who was your favorite Miss Anne, who was your least favorite.
Well, my least favorite was Fannie Hurst because I think she contributed least and she paid no cost. I came away from this book with a lot of sympathy for these white women, because even though each of them came with limited racial ideas, I mean, each of them brought her own racism into what she did. They were all anti-racists, but they also were raised in a racist culture, and none of them were able to leave that racism behind. But with the exception of Fannie Hurst, they all paid their dues, and they earned my respect because they paid their dues. I fell in love most with Josephine Cogdell Schuyler, probably because she paid the highest dues, I think, of all of these women. But I also really developed an enormous affection for Lillian Wood, because Lillian Wood moved so deeply into a black world that she passed as a black woman for over 20 years. And she moved furthest away from the world she grew up into. And that fascinated me.
I think I've been mispronouncing. It's Schuyler, not
Schuyler.
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 Okay. It was a fascinating book. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for having me.
We're out of time. I want to thank Dr. Carla Kaplan for joining me today. Miss Anne in Harlem, The White Women of the Black Renaissance, has been published by HarperCollins. For the City University of New York and One to One, I'm Cheryl McCarthy. If there are any people you'd like to hear from or topics you'd like us to explore, please let us know. You can write to me at CUNY TV, 365 Fifth Avenue, New York, 10016, or you can go to the website at cuny.tv and click on Contact Us. I look forward to hearing from you.